Hi, Jason.
Hi, Sandris.
And, and the first question is what is a good musical composition for you?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think I may have different definitions for myself and for others. For me personally, I think that when I'm creating a new work, I want to be surprised by the outcome. And I think also as a listener, I prefer to feel as though I'm being challenged or though I'm experiencing something that I or another person couldn't have otherwise conceived. And so, I mean, there's all kinds of technical criteria with which you can evaluate what is goodness. But I think also the terms good and bad, like as value judgments for artistic work, are also a little bit problematic, right? Because they have to do a lot with our aesthetic bias, with our training, with our background, socially or culturally. And I don't know, it's dependent really upon, I think, the artist's intention as well, and whether or not they were
Yes,
successful in realizing that thing that they set out to do.
yes. But for you, right? What is
For me,
yes for you?
I think I really want to challenge myself and grow with each work. So each piece that I create, I feel like it should be a kind of extension, in a sense, of the previous piece. That doesn't mean that it necessarily deals with the same issues or that it uses the same technology, but rather that I want to feel a sense of growth and forward motion. And if that happens, even if the piece is received poorly and maybe there are other problematic things, then I think it's in a way it's a success because I've managed to grow and change as an individual and as an artist.
And what is let's say your musical style or musical ideas or ideas which you more frequently, right? More frequently use or think in your compositions or develop in your compositions.
Yeah. Well, I think increasingly my work deals with human behavior and the way that we interact with one another, exchanges, interpersonal relationships. And I'm interested in these kinds of phenomena. And as I work more and more with technology, with things like video and gestural tracking and other forms of processing, I I think less and less I'm concerned with prescribing um, specific, discrete, like sonic uh, objects, sonic materials, and more interested in how it is that the performers behave in response to certain kinds of notation or stimulus or situations. And so, with my more recent works, I think that's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a situation to which the performers respond.
Mm-hmm. And you said that you two things, right? You said this one is like building this situation, right? Um, of, of interaction, and the second is technology, right? And regarding technology, you said more and more you are using this gesture controllers and other technologies.
Yeah.
What triggers you? What triggered you to more focus on technology?
I mean, I was always fascinated by technology, and I think as a kid, growing up like in the 90s, I was fascinated by computers. I was like on Napster. I was an electric guitarist before, and so I was already working with analog pedals, distortion, processing sound, and that sort of led organically toward working in the recording studio, working with microphone techniques, working with different kinds of processing plugins, and the experimentation of like layering sound and working with sound in different ways. And so I feel like that eventually led to first pieces that dealt with real-time digital signal processing and sound file triggering and playback. And as I was working more and more on these kinds of pieces, I wanted there to be a closer relationship between what the performers were doing and the activity of the electronic sound. So this idea of causation or correlation really between the behavior of the performers, the choices that they would make during the performance on stage, and what the resulting sound utilizing the technology would be. I always felt there was a disconnect. And there are a lot of pieces where, say, the automation parameters are prescribed in advance, everything is pre-composed, everything is worked out before the piece is performed, and then you can create this kind of illusion of correlation between those two things. But what gestural tracking, to me, what it really achieves is the ability to have a situation where the technology is responding to the performer. Mm-hmm. And that's really now, I think, what I'm primarily interested in.
Mm-hmm. And maybe there was some piece which triggered that interest.
A piece of mine?
Or like a piece of your?
Yeah. I think, well, the first piece where I really started to work with gestural tracking was this piece, Surface Tension, in 2018. Now, before that, I was playing a lot with like video processing and audio processing and trying to find ways to really successfully fuse these two elements. But it wasn't until I went to Geneva in 2018 and I was working there at the Embassy of Foreign Artists that I had the time to kind of sit down and develop this system where it leveraged a lot of the software that I had built earlier using video processing.
Yes.
Instead of being randomized or predetermined, it would actually respond to the coordinates of the performer's actions. So that was in 2018, and then in 2019, I composed a piece called All Forgetting Is Retrieval, which was performed in Thailand with the TACETi Ensemble. And that is a piece for like augmented conductor, where the actions of the conductor actually triggers sound and influences the manipulation of sound on stage.
It's for me, right? It seems this right two elements, right, which you want to combine. One is technology, and one is this when you put performers in situations, right, when they need to interact. And regarding technology, right, it seems it's like self-obvious thing, because it's what we see that there is a lot more and more like various technologies entering into our lives, right, and even this speed of adoption, accelerating, speed of creation technologies accelerating. And this is somehow my feel the answer, right? But what was triggered to think about this situation, right? Why interest there? Why you are interested in the second element, right?
The second element being the technology, or
the first is technology, but between situations when musicians interact, situations and etc. Right?
Yeah. Well,
because you can use technology in different ways, right? And,
sure. Yeah, certainly. Well, I guess what I can say is, being trained at American universities in the kind of American system, there's this kind of approach to like theory and pitch organization and composition that is very, and that's not to say that that's not true in Europe, because of course also this is the case, but there's a lot of like emphasis on compositional rigor and on the treatment of pitch material and organization of pitch, organization of rhythm. And I composed some pieces in 2013, 2014 that were very rigorous and labor intensive. And although I was satisfied with the outcome, I wasn't really satisfied with the process. I felt that I wasn't actually enjoying the work that I was doing. And I think to some extent that's an important element, right? I mean, if you're just laboring over this thing all the time and there's no enjoyment in it. And so I started to work, I think, a lot more intuitively than in my earlier work. And as I was working more intuitively, I was questioning a lot of things about like the precision and the amount of data that was like compressed into each score. So my scores at that time were very intricate, and there's a lot of information that the performers need to parse. And increasingly, you know, as I was working in this way, I was thinking about interpretive freedom and about allowing the performers to make more choices and giving them more more almost authority as like a kind of co-composer, so that they could be permitted to interpret the materials much more freely. And I think as I started to work in this way, maybe in 2015 or something, I became really interested in the work of, for instance, Georges Apergis, who, you know, is approaching a lot of things from a more kind of from a more theatrical perspective. And because I've always been fascinated also with theater and film, I thought that I wanted to try to let go a little bit of control, let go of the amount of like how precisely I was prescribing each and every sonic parameter. And so in giving more freedom to the performers, I started then to think about, okay, well, then how can I, if they're making decisions that I am surprised by
Yes.
as a composer, how can I actually create a system that responds to that and that adapts and changes based on the choices that they make in real time? Because that normally that's not something you can really do as a composer. You can create constraints and boundaries within which they are kind of forced to operate, but to actually create a situation where something is responding to that, not another human, but a system. That is what was really interesting to me. And I think that also mimics our relationship to technology like social media, email, text messaging, you know, all of these interactions that we have even now, right? It's mediated by some kind of technology or social media or texting platform. And so I think art that in a way kind of emulates that relationship is really interesting and relevant today.
Coming back to technologies, right? What is for you, like, let's say, is the most important technological artifact? It could be hardware or software.
You know, it's changing all the time. The most, did you say the most interesting or the most relevant?
The most important, right? Which you use the most, right? If you will look on your pieces, right?
Yeah.
The things which you use, let's say, more often.
Sure. Well, I honestly, when I'm composing, I usually try to compose with pencil and paper first and foremost. So it depends on if you're talking about the performance or the compositional process, because the compositional process, I'm very like low tech actually. I don't want my decisions to be influenced by the machine, by the box, you know?
Yes, I got it.
And work with, say, notation software, or you work with a DAW, or you work with Max or whatever else. To some extent, the speed with which you can imagine and create, it's really limited by the properties of that particular system. So like there's certain things that Finale does really well, or certain things that Sibelius does really well, or certain things that Max does really well. And we have a tendency then to gravitate toward those things. But actually, I don't want to be influenced by that. I want to imagine a situation, imagine a system, imagine musical materials. And then later, what I'll do is then I'll develop the notation or develop the software or develop the audio materials or visual materials that are like a realization of that initial kind of draft or blueprint, you know? So in the compositional process, maybe the most important technology is just the internet. I mean, research, maybe YouTube videos or audio samples or something, working with the musicians to develop certain materials. Like if I say, okay, I really need to hear what does it sound like if you do X, Y, Z. But then later in the performance, of course, like there's a lot of hardware, cameras, microphones, audio interfaces, all of this stuff that is really critical. I'd say not to the composition, but to the performance and the documentation.
Yes, yes. And for this part, which is these technologies which you have used the most, looking back.
I mean, Macs consistently.
Macs, okay.
Macs for pretty much everything. But as far as actually like constructing audio, I'm working actually still with Pro Tools. I've been a Pro Tools user for ages, and I've been thinking about switching and, you know, using other things, but I'm still using Pro Tools to kind of create composite sounds as a kind of foundation that is underlying the entire work. So if there are individual sounds that are triggered or a sound that is associated with a particular event, all of this is developed first in a DAW, like Pro Tools in my case, and then later triggered using Macs.
And hardware?
It's totally dependent upon the situation. I mean, a laptop in the first,
okay.
But then, you know, various audio interfaces, mics, increasingly with the sensors and the gestural tracking. I've been using these Bitolino RIoT sensors, which are excellent. And the first time around, I was using Wiimotes, these old Nintendo video game controllers. But I found that some of the software that you needed in order to translate the information from the Wiimotes into Macs, like there's this program called Osculator, I found it a little bit buggy and not so reliable. So the RIoTs are great because they use a Wi-Fi network rather than Bluetooth. And Bluetooth technology also is limited in how far it can reach, right? So if you have a computer in the back of the room and you're trying to retrieve data from controllers on the stage, you need a pretty long range. And so Wi-Fi is much better for that.
And what fascinates you in this gesture sensors? Why you are using them? Because you are quite often in quite many pieces, right? You have used that technology.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, because I've been working on this for a while, but I had a few projects that kind of took me away from that. In 2020, I worked on a piece only using analog technology without using any kind of digital technology. And so I really only have two pieces presently that use sensors and gestural tracking, but this is something that I've been planning to develop for a long time. And I'm working now on a couple of projects that will take the software that I already developed for gestural tracking and develop it further to be implemented in pieces for larger ensembles. Because right now, the two pieces that I have that use sensors are surface tension, which is for two percussionists. Yes. And then this ensemble piece, it's an octet with the conductor as a performer.
Yes, and what fascinates you in this technology?
I mean, again, I think it comes back to this idea of having a real correlation between the performers and the resulting sound or video. In a lot of pieces for video, myself included, but works by other composers too, it sometimes feels to me a little bit like the video is sort of an afterthought, you know? that the video is superimposed upon something that is already existing. And even if it's conceptually related, or there are images that are kind of reflecting the composition and the composition's narrative, sometimes it feels like there's quite a disconnect between those two things. And so what I really wanted to do is create music where the video elements are much more carefully intertwined with the compositional narrative. So it really feels as though the video is essential. And the whether you're talking about video or audio, the gestural tracking is a means with which to more precisely fuse those two things, right? Because it's funny, as a composer working with Macs, right? Whether you're using DSP or you're using sound file triggering or you're using whatever other kind of thing, video playback, we have to kind of consider in advance, before we even hear the music in rehearsal, we have to consider what it is that's going to happen at every moment and how those things, those elements, materials that we deploy using a program like Max or like Ableton, we have to think about how those things will actually react to and fuse with the things that the live performers are doing. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's sort of guesswork because, yeah, okay, we plan everything out and we say, okay, in measure 37, there's this synchronization point and event 19 corresponds to that, and these all line up. But if something goes wrong in performance, or if the composition is open to some extent that allows interpretive freedom and allows the performers, say, to take a little bit more time or to do something a little bit different than that departs from what is in the note work, then you have a situation where you can't really plan for that. You know, I can take all the time that I want to meticulously notate everything that I want to happen. But the minute that the performer deviates from that plan, then I have a problem, which is that those two things don't line up, right? So in a very kind of practical way, the sensors can serve as a means to ensure that when the performers do X, then Y happens in the electronics. In a very simple way, that's what's kind of happening. But it's also a lot more complex than that. Because, for instance, in the piece with the augmented conductor, all forgetting is retrieval, there is a chance element. There's a random element where there's a kind of reservoir of audio files that are retrieved freely, randomly, dependent upon the conductor's actions. So within a specified event, like a measure, he might flick his wrist 17 times or 19 times. And I can't plan for that, you know. I could tell him only do it 17 times, but of course there's always a chance that it could be 18, right?
Yes.
And it screws everything up. So by having this kind of freedom so that you can say, okay, anything happens within this box, you're free to do anything, then it's only when we move forward to the next event that then the reservoir changes. So then within the confines of this event, anything can happen and the system is robust enough that it will still function and it will respond to what the performers do. And there's something I think that's really kind of beautiful in that, that is certainly more sophisticated than at least the way that I was working with Max before,
yes,
which just as a kind of means to like synchronize and deploy sound files or automation for processing.
And what is your process of composing? How you start and what kind of stages you go through?
Yeah. Well, it always starts usually with some kind of proposal, you know, like an ensemble or a person will write to me and say, hey, I'd love to do something with you that involves XYZ. or maybe I'll have an idea that I want to do something for string quartet or for contrabass clarinet, and I reach out to somebody and say, hey, what if we were to collaborate in this way? It always starts, I think, with the person, you know, or the people. And then once we establish some criteria for the project, like the instrumentation, the different materials or technology that are involved, then I work to develop some kind of concept that speaks to me and that I think relates to the interests and the abilities of that person or that situation. And then usually what will happen is I'll start by creating a kind of, again, reservoir, I guess I like this word, a reservoir of materials that are possible within this configuration. So say that I have a piece for alto flute, bass clarinet, and trombone. I might start by thinking about, well, what are all the different things that are possible using the alto flute? Or what are all the different things that are possible using the trombone? And once I kind of establish my materials, I might try to kind of more narrowly define what is appropriate or what I feel, which elements I want to use in that particular work. And then I began composing in a linear way. And it changes a little bit for each piece, you know. But it's usually kind of like pulling out one thread or one voice. So I say, okay, if this is happening at the beginning of the piece, then I think about how the other voices or elements may respond to or react to those musical objects or those events. So if the trombone does this, then I think about how does the bass clarinet correspond to that? Are they supporting the musical ideas that are, or the kind of trajectory of the line that is already in play? Or are they negating that? Are they contrasting that? And often with regard to technology, I'm thinking kind of in the back of my mind about how technology might be employed in that moment. And maybe I'll make some kind of annotation or something in the sketch that says, hey, here, this thing is going to happen. But oftentimes, I'll try and really work with the kind of acoustic materials, like the instrumental elements first, with some concept about how the technology will be employed, and then later find a way to kind of integrate those things once I'm actually working with the software that I'll be using. Now, that being said, like if each piece kind of develops and grows from the previous piece, right, with regard to the technology that is used and the knowledge that I gain from that performance in that situation, then I might already know, like, oh, this thing that I did in that previous piece where this event triggered XYZ, I might find a way to employ that in this new piece. And I think every composer must do that, right? You learn a kind of like bag of tricks, right? Things that are available to you, materials that you know are successful or that can somehow be utilized. And then that's going to be in the back of my mind. And I say, okay, this would be a great place for XYZ to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And looking back, Brett, on your own music, how it's changed during the last 10 years?
In the last 10 years?
Yeah.
A lot. A lot, I'd say. Man, well, so about 11 years ago, I moved to Hamburg for a Fulbright Fellowship. And I was studying there.
And you moved from US, yes?
From the US, yeah. So I was living in California, grew up in California, moved to Las Vegas, did my master's there, and then moved to Germany in 2010. And I'd say that, you know, my experience there in Hamburg was so radically different from the US. I really was exposed, I think, to this entire other way of thinking about art making, thinking about composition, a whole other body of work and composers that I was unfamiliar with. And it really challenged me. And I think I did compose some works while I was in Hamburg, but actually it was later when I returned to the US and I was reflecting on that and reflecting on those experiences, that I started to feel this real kind of internal conflict. Like I had these two selves that were divided, you know, my former self and my kind of like aesthetic and artistic identity that I felt like I was comfortable with and had established. And then this whole other kind of mode of thinking about composition and art and aesthetics that was new to me and that I really was passionate about and curious about and wanted to investigate. And I remember having some conversations with my teachers at Eastman, at the Eastman School of Music, about this kind of conflict, like these two identities. And eventually, you know, I realized that I didn't have to have like a pseudonym and have a different identity and compose pieces in this style and pieces in that style, but that those two things and the things that I thought were most important about each of those sides of myself could eventually be kind of fused and could meet. And I think it was really around 2012, 2013 that I started to feel like I no longer had that internal conflict, that I could really create work that I felt fulfilled both sides of my identity and what it was I was trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And you spent some time in Thailand as well, right?
Yeah, I taught in Thailand for actually 4.5 years. I was physically there for almost 4, and then I was teaching remotely for the last little bit. But I moved to Thailand in 2018, in June of 2018.
And how your time in Thailand impacted your music and your musical thoughts? Like looking back, right?
Yeah, well, I think in lots of ways. I became close friends with a composer there who I think maybe you interviewed before, Piawat Lualar. And it's funny, we actually met at Cornell during a switch ensemble residency where I was actually offered the job in Thailand while I was there in Ithaca. And I remember having some conversations with Piawat about this and whether to take the job. And, you know, I was a little concerned. It's on the other side of the world. I felt like I would be removed from and disconnected from my communities in the US and in Europe. And it was a big move for me, but I decided to take the job. And what was great was that Piawat was in the process of establishing this new, I mean, he had an ensemble called the TACETi Ensemble, which they're still around and they're doing a lot. They're doing a tour in New York right now. And they were in the process of building this new festival, which used to be called the TINMAS, Thailand New Music and Art Symposium, and now it's called Intact. And they commissioned me for that work that I mentioned, All Forgetting His Retrieval, the piece for augmented conductor. And the collaboration that we had on that work, I think, was really important. I felt they were really open to anything, and they really wanted to support me and realize my artistic vision. And because to some extent I felt that I had been a little bit removed, although I was traveling back and forth to New York quite a bit, removed from, you know, the community of artists that I had been collaborating with before. It was really nice to, you know, be there and be with these people who were really excited about collaboration and excited about working together. And I'll just say that, you know, I had so many students in Thailand that were fantastic, like really brilliant students who were doing really interesting and challenging work too. But it was a mixed bag, you know. It's so different over there. But I can't complain about being in Thailand during the pandemic. It was a pretty good situation. And we were basically zero COVID for the first year there. While everybody else was shut down, we were hanging out on the beach and traveling, and it was great. But at the same time, there's this kind of, I don't know, I mean, seeing the rest of the world shut down, there was this kind of guilt associated with that too. Like, I don't know. I was also working on these telematic projects with Switch and with UT Austin at the same time. And it was this very strange network of all these different contrasting things between COVID, between Thailand, hanging out on the beach, rock climbing, and then, trying to create very sophisticated computer music, networked music over the web between these different discrete locations. It was a very special experience, I guess. And I definitely think that that will continue to influence my art making in the future. But how? It's hard. It's a little hard to say.
And what do you fear as composer?
Stasis, I think.
Can you just a little bit elaborate on that?
I guess what I fear is no longer being able to create work that is new or that is relevant or that is meaningful or compelling. Repeating myself, maybe. I think that with each new work, I really try to challenge myself and to, of course, you want to create work that where you have a kind of identity, you have a particular artistic fingerprint or certain like aesthetic elements that are consistent. So you want to be identifiable. You want someone to hear the work and say, hey, that's this composer. But at the same time, I really want to try and do something new with each and every piece. And I think, I wouldn't say that I fear it per se, but it contributes to writer's block. It contributes to, self-doubt and self-criticism that I think we all deal with as artists and as composers. I mean, if you don't, then maybe that's problematic. But I think that this kind of filter with which we use to critique our own ideas and our own materials is also really important. So like, in a way, it's fear, but it's more than that also, because it's also part of the creative process.
Mm-hmm. And why do you still compose?
I think that I still compose because I believe that I have something to contribute. I believe that I have ideas and a way of thinking about composition and artistic work that is different than others. And ideally, everyone has a different set of ideas and a different set of motivations for creating work. And so because of that, I think that I want to bring something new into the world that might challenge people or raise questions or change someone else's thinking. I'm not necessarily successful in that, but I feel like it's worth trying. And, I mean, you commit so much of your life to something that you love deeply. You want to find ways to realize whatever vision it is that you have, and I think, I have been composing for a pretty long time now. And even before that, had an interest in music and in technology. Maybe it's partly that there's nothing else that I would want to do or would rather do, but also I guess this maybe naive sense that I do have something to say that is different than other people. And I hope that I can create something that maybe no one else could have imagined, right? And and each person's identity, you know, contributes to their artistic work, the experiences that they have, their training, their social and cultural conditioning. And I hope that I have something that comes out of that, you know, that weird mix and blend of things.
If you were a female, would your music would be different?
Of course. I mean, if I was anything other than what I am, my music would be different, I think.
Is there like let's say more masculine or more feminine music?
I wouldn't
Or it's artificial or it's
well,
artificial categories.
yeah, I would hesitate to simplify it as much as that. But I think that certainly, again, all of our experiences and our conditioning lead to the art that we create. You can't get around that, really. I mean, there are ways that you can create art that is like the antithesis of who you are as a person, but I think our identity contributes deeply to the work that we do. Now, that doesn't mean that all men must or need to create masculine music and all women create feminine music. And even that idea of feminine music, I think, is problematic, or masculine music. But yeah, but I understand what you mean by that. I mean, again, it's a question of identity, right? And I think if anything changed about my identity, if I had grown up in Thailand, or if I had grown up in Canada, or if I had had a different set of teachers, then it would influence the outcome, you know, of the work that I do.
And looking back, right, how new music or contemporary art music changed during this century?
Well, certainly during this century,
This century, yes.
I'd say certainly increased interest, I think, in technology and in alternate mediums or media. Certainly, there were composers before working with film, working with video, but certainly in the you know, in my generation of composers and younger composers, I think there's a lot of interest in going outside of what is conventionally considered like musical materials, more than just sound. And I definitely think there are lots of young composers who are interested in just diversification of material, you know. And sometimes I question that, like for myself, I question, why am I investing so much time in learning like GLSL or OpenGL or Jitter or whatever? Why am I investing so much time in video or in telematic performance, where when at the end of the day, I'm trained as a composer, my primary interest is sound, my primary interest is performance with sound and with musicians. Why do I invest so much time and energy in film and in video and in these other technologies? And I think really it's just because I'm looking for something new. I'm looking for some kind of new experience, some kind of new situation, something that changes the way that we approach performance and approach music making as musicians from a musical compositional perspective. And I think it's healthy, you know, even if maybe a lot of time is invested in these other technologies and these other non-musical materials. If that knowledge and if that research comes back around and changes the way that I approach musical composition, then I think ultimately it's a good thing. Even if, you know, I mean, talking to some older composers or, you know, the older generation of teachers, some people may poo-poo this a little bit and say, well, okay, why are you spending so much time on video or on gestural tracking or on machine learning? But I think actually, just like if I were to study another discipline, or if I were a visual artist and then I came around and I began to study musical composition, I think that that background and that experience contributes to hopefully creating more meaningful art.
Mm-hmm. And how new music audience change?
Well, I mean, to some extent, this is speculation because, like, I can only speak to my own experience and concerts that I've attended and stuff. But the way that we consume music and concerts and performances, this has changed, right? I mean, with live streaming, with YouTube, the quality of documentation of concerts these days is much higher than it used to be. And so it can be that people are consuming or experiencing music and art in a different space, in a virtual space online, where it's also mediated or edited by another person, which maybe that changes the experience too drastically, and maybe it's not a good thing. But the flip side of that is that there are now people like young composers or composers in other countries who have access to this music and these performances that otherwise there's 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there's no way that you could have like a teenager in Thailand listening to music that was premiered at Darmstadt yesterday, right? This is a new thing, which is really beautiful, actually. And I think that it will lead to more globalization and more kind of a like just leveling out the amount of exposure and education that people have all over the world. And that's a really good thing. Even if maybe there's something lacking, it's not the same as experiencing it in the same room, But I think that it opens up the door to a lot of new people having access to this work. That said, it's up to them whether or not they want to tune in and listen to a concert at Darmstadt. But they can, it's possible now.
And right, and if what is your imagination? Let's say, what could be new music outlook for year 2040? Right, what will be the major trends and how it will look?
That's so hard to say. I mean, I can only comment on the things that I observed today and the kind of trends. Certainly, as I said, there's a lot of interest now in video, and I think people working with video, it's becoming a lot more sophisticated. And I don't only mean like live video processing or triggering video files, but like animation, 3D animation, real-time animation that maybe is like responsive and reacts to the behavior of performers, sort of like I was talking about before. I think also machine learning and AI, these will probably be major fields of research and contributors to the work of composers in the next generation. I think also virtual reality, augmented reality, these things are going to become commonplace pretty soon, like 5-10 years from now. And already, we're talking about virtual concerts that take place in a virtual space. And as more devices become available to consumers that allow us to engage with those kinds of platforms, I think that work will start being created in those mediums. And it's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating. I don't know exactly how I feel about it and how I would like to engage with that, but definitely I think it's possible that very interesting work could be done in those areas.
And the last question is how you see what is role of new music, right, in let's say in society, in United States society, right? Because you mostly, right, as I understand, you most of the life spend there, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd say it's limited. I'd say it's very limited. you know, I mean, the number of people that even know that this discipline exists, it's quite small. But that said, I think if you look historically at the way that music has changed over the years and the way that, say, recording technology and the dissemination of recordings has changed music, not only the consumption of music and like purchasing of music, but also the way that we make music. I think that in the past, there are lots of examples that you can cite of experimental composers and experimental musicians influencing popular culture and influencing the way that music has changed over the years. And like a classic example that I sometimes use is Stockhausen, right? With like the Beatles, with tape loops and things like this. I would like to think that the work that we are doing today as experimental musicians, as composers, will influence the way that music changes, not only in popular culture, but like in all musics and all creativity, will in some way influence or help these other artists to grow and to look at new ways of approaching art making. And I think it's all intertwined too, you know? So like the experimentation and the things that we do as composers today may influence, say, filmmakers in 40 years, or may influence virtual reality artists in the future. And I think that that's a real thing, you know? It's impossible to predict, and there's no point really in speculating like how, you know, the way in which one person's body of work will change the future. But I think as a whole, like the community of experimental musicians and composers, I think we do contribute to society in a meaningful way, but it's hard to trace the impact like in present. You know, you can only see 30 years from now, 40 years from now, maybe we may be able to trace a line between these two things, but it's not really I know I'm not a historian. It's not my place to speculate about how our work will change the future, but I think it will. Maybe I'm an optimist.
So thank you very much, Jason, for this interview.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanders. It was great to talk.